but a warm welcome to all of you to the Grand Round today. So I'm Crespin, I'm one of the physios in the pain service at MBT. And it's my pleasure to welcome Steve Cairns, a very good friend of mine, who's going to provide us with today's Grand Round talk. So Steve was a patient at Southmead Hospital not so long ago, and the narrative that he's going to share with us today is just really a unique insight and a really fresh perspective on the themes of movement and rehabilitation. And I'm hoping that Steve has recovered enough from Liverpool's loss to Burnley last night to still be able to give us this talk this afternoon.
No, I'm in trauma. I need to get to high dependency.
Yeah. So we might, if anyone's but anyway, so Steve, thank you so much for coming to talk to the Grand Round today, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
No, thanks, Kristen. Well, today's talk is ultimately going to be about neuro rehabilitation, or rather restoring movement skills in brain injury patients, and how a movement pattern approach led one of Southmead's resident neurosurgeons to describe the results as amazing and contrary to conventional wisdom. I'm going to use my own personal story to show how this approach came to be, and I'll also take you through a case study of how it's currently being successfully applied remotely via video technology to rehab a patient in the US, one for whom 3.5 years of prior conventional methods had proved ineffective. First of all, I'd like to set out a couple of baselines with reference to neuro rehabilitation and also explain the term movement patterns. In October of last year, I attended and presented at the World Congress for Neuro Rehabilitation. And on each day of the Congress, there was a headline presentation from the World Federation. And I'd like to include some of their material here from their Relearning to Walk presentation. I'd like to show you a graph that was used to represent recovery in brain injury patients. I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is that up there? The graph's a little anecdotal, but it's quite clear in what it's conveying, and it's quite useful. What is abundantly clear is that after steady progress in the first 3 months, improvement in function tails off. In fact, it was the WF's accepted and advocated premise that after 6 months, no further significant improvement is possible. Basically, if a patient wasn't walking by then, it's recommended that rehabilitation objectives look to alternatives to walking. And if you take this graph as your model, then it's clear you must aspire to reach your rehab goals in those first 3 months. The WF recommended strategy was to immediately try to teach the patient to walk again and to use a high number of repetition in these attempts. If the patient was already attempting walking independently, then great. If not, then it would do so with assistance, and that can be the help of another person, or it can be with a walking adjunct, such as a handrail or something like a Zimmer or a cane. Now, this model has pretty significant implications when you bear in mind that there's over 800,000 people in the UK alone that are living with disabilities as a result of stroke. And these numbers are something like over 3 million in the US, and so worldwide the figures are going to be enormous. So the implications of this golden 3 months and then a forever barren period that follows after 6 makes for pretty grim reading. So with those rather foreboding goalposts set out, I'd like to explain the term movement patterns. When you look at humans with respect to movement, we are both hardware and software. The hardware is all of the physical working parts of your body, and your brain and central nervous system are the software that controls it. So while any one activity can be given a single label, such as walking, it's never a singular and isolated skill. It's a pattern. It's a combination of hardware and software. And although any one activity can be considered a single pattern, the pattern's made up of many other patterns, each of which can be reused to make different movement patterns for different activities. And we aren't born with these patterns in place. We've got to build them ourselves. And we do this with all of the movement that fills our daily lives. And this building of patterns in the brain is known as neuroplasticity. And science had previously believed that all of the connections in our brains were fixed and couldn't be added to and couldn't be changed. But it's now known that the potential for neuroplasticity, this ability to create new patterns, continues through the entirety of our lives. It's not just when we're young. And these patterns get stronger the more we use them, and they fade the more that we don't. So basically, it's a case of if you don't use it, you lose it. And perhaps counterintuitively, this should actually be considered a positive, because when a baby is developing its movement, it doesn't choose and build movement patterns cognitively. Neuroplasticity is actually stimulated by exploring and experiencing its new environment. It's not the other way around, that the baby just constantly explores available options, and it's the efficient and productive ones that are repeated. And walking is a very complex task. A baby doesn't fail to immediately walk because it lacks the mental maturity to cognitively work out what walking is. It has to build each pattern in sequence. So for best development, you would want only the good options to remain, and you would want the bad or unproductive ones to fade. So if you've only got good options available, you can only make good choices. And it's this aspect of neuroplasticity in what's called the neural development sequence that leads to all babies to ultimately take the same overall development path. And it's neuroplasticity that allows people to recover movement skills that are lost to stroke and brain injury. And I'd like to take a quick pause there and contrast what we saw in the graph. Because if the scope for neurological growth remains throughout an entire lifetime, then how come there's this barren period for significant improvement 6 months post-surgery or post-injury? Surely if neuroplasticity is ever available, then the recovery curve should be a never-ending road. So while you think on that point, I'll take you back to April 2017, where at the age of 47, I suffered a severe brain hemorrhage and stroke. Excuse me. I lost the ability to walk. I had weakness down the left-hand side, vomiting, double vision, and an inability to focus visually. I had a cavernoma on my brainstem, and this had bled and had caused a stroke. I wasn't dead, which is always a winner, but especially in light of the fact that mortality in brainstem bleeds can be as high as 70%. From an evolutionary point of view, the brainstem is one of the oldest parts of the brain, and it's also one of the most eloquent. It's one of the least able to sustain damage, and the deficits as a result of any damage are far-reaching. Now, this was all pretty bad luck. However, what was lucky, and lucky almost to the point that it seemed like predetermination, was that the previous 20 years of my life was such perfect preparation for that moment that I was able to look after and manage my own recovery, and to do so to the extent of producing results that most specialists in this area would consider as exceeding the art of the possible. And this is what my story is about. In 1997, I joined the Reserve Armed Forces and successfully tried out for the Parachute Regiment. After 2 years service in the Paras, I did SAS selection, and once again I was successful, and I went on to serve 12 years with the regiment. As a SAS soldier, you're required to train in order to bring at least one additional specialist skill to the party, and for me that skill was medical. I did a patrol med course, an advanced patrol med course, and a special forces trauma course. And the latter is a world-respected course that's also recognised by the Royal College of Surgeons. Now, as far as medical skills go, this was obviously all trauma-based and obviously nothing to do with neuro rehab. However, it did give me a good understanding of anatomy and physiology, and it sat helpfully alongside the sports and exercise science knowledge that I'd acquired through my own training to pass selection. For 6 of the 12 years of my service with the regiment, I was an instructor on the regimental training team, and this was split into 2 3-year placements either side of an operational tour of Afghanistan. And it's the responsibility of the training team to manage and prepare recruits for selection. And this is it's a 6-month course of constant examination and training, and it finishes with a grueling assessment that's known as test week. For my first 3-year placement, the success rate on the course varied between 0 and 1%. And for 5 out of the 6 courses at that time, the entire regiment only produced 1 successful recruit. Now, it's supposed to be hard, but being that hard is unsustainable for the regiment as a whole. And the most common reason for failure in recruits was injury. And that's not traumatic injury, as in falling over and breaking a leg or even twisting an ankle. It was essentially things that would equate to chronic sports injuries. The nature of training hadn't changed for years. It was the standard sort of cliche stuff, you know, sort of do press-ups until your head falls off. How fast did you do that run? Fast? Yeah, okay, do it faster next time. And that was about as sophisticated as it got. But nothing had changed, and something needed to. I was aware I was going to be a senior figure on the training team after a return from Afghanistan. So I wanted to make that change. In the weeks prior to my deployment, I suffered a shoulder injury and was referred to a specialist in Liverpool called Paddy Phillips. And Paddy is probably the best and single most effective clinical therapist I've worked with. And on my return from operations in Afghanistan, I decided to bring him into the training team. Now, in trying to tackle the wonders of technology, Crispin, am I back online with the audience?
Yeah, you're good, Steve. Yeah.
Apologies, I've no idea what's happened here. I've come back in via my mobile phone, so hopefully the laptop will be back on, especially when it comes to sharing the screen. I'm trying to, I think I was back to when I brought Paddy Phillips onto the training team and trying to tackle the problem of recruits failing through injury. So the first thing we asked was, is this a hardware problem or a software problem? The recruits were high performing athletes, but the Western movement lifestyle is all pervasive. And we found that most had posture or range of movement flaws. Now, we corrected these. However, just because somebody has the potential to move optimally doesn't mean that they will move optimally. These recruits had imprinted their movement patterns using flawed hardware and had done so with frequency, intensity, and duration. And given how movement patterns strengthen through use, this is the equivalent of press and save on an altered Word document. So after fixing the hardware, we were now going to have to reprogram the software. And rather than assess and address each recruit individually, we took them all back to the very bottom of the movement pyramid. We got them rolling, we got them crawling, and then squatting. And only once competent in these patterns did we start the sort of training used in previous courses. And the improvement was remarkable. There were 6 training locations in all, and the previous pass rate of 0 to 1% remained in place at all of these, all except ours. Ours rose to over 50%. And for the final selection card that I was involved in, my location started with the smallest number of recruits. Yet at the end, we had more passes than all of the other locations put together. I left the regiment in 2011, and disappointingly, the old training regime returned and results fell off a cliff and immediately returned to their previous low. So I continued my own training and research after leaving the regiment, and this included acquiring some functional movement certifications over in the US. And I swear this next bit is true. Given the success I'd had in training and retraining both myself and movement quality in the recruits, I always wondered why these methods weren't used to rehab brain injury patients. And so I think I potentially wondered a little too hard, and I then ended up in Southmead with a stroke and a weight and brain surgery. So I was an inpatient, and I was scheduled for a craniotomy in just over 2 weeks. So within that time, I decided that I would try to teach myself to walk again, but not by repeated attempts of trying to walk, but I do so by following the neural development sequence. My wife Sam brought an exercise mat in, and I started to rehab myself on the hospital floor. And I focused on the primitive movement patterns which walking depends on. I was rolling around, crawling, squatting, and within 2 weeks I was walking. Now, the day before my surgery was due, I was given a physical assessment by a doctor and a physio, and during this assessment it was ascertained that only one of the 3 people in the room could perform a deep squat, and I imagine you probably know who that was. And this is a really important point, because despite the relative youth and despite the fact that both the doctor and the physio clearly had the skills to walk, it was demonstrated that should they have needed to, neither the doctor or the physio had the posture or physical range of movement to actually learn to walk. These are 2 different things. This is crucial, and it's the fundamental flaw in the classic model. Both the doctor and the physio would have considered themselves to be physically fit, but this is overwhelmingly not the case with the average stroke patient, who's typically going to be over 50 and typically not going to be physically fit. So this is only going to make posture and range of movement flaws worse, and likewise the prospects of trying to immediately relearn to walk. On the 31st of April 2017, I had 10.5 hours of brainstem surgery, and I think a good correlation to the extent of deficits that are going to be incurred as a result of the surgery is the amount of time spent under the knife. This isn't a given, but I'm sure if somebody just went in there and rummaged around with a blunt spoon for about 2 hours, I'm sure the results wouldn't be terribly good. But in the groups that I've mixed in, it appears that the average surgery time is approximately 5 hours or less, and I'd had 10.5. After the stroke, I couldn't walk, but after the surgery, I couldn't even crawl, and my hemiparesis was now bilateral. The prognosis was a recovery with permanent deficits and a potential need for a walking adjunct. However, this assessment was made using the classic model of Neuro Rehabilitation. So after a day spent in high dependency and 3 days in intensive care, I started managing my own rehab, and I needed to get into a different environment. Hospital beds are to keep you safe and stop you falling out. This wasn't helpful for me. It just provided a barrier and a disincentive to getting out and moving about on the floor. So I'd been in hospital for more than 3 weeks, and I could feel myself just starting to rust, and I was stiffening up and losing my mobility, and having the necessary range of movement to acquire the primitive movement patterns was going to be essential. So given my previous 20 years experience and my success in rehabbing my my stroke deficits prior to surgery, I felt the classic model was only going to hold me back, and I wanted to manage my own recovery, and I felt I could quite literally walk my talk. So 7 days post-op and only 3 days after exiting intensive care, I signed myself out of hospital, still unable to walk. And when I returned home, to use as a baseline, I filmed myself trying to walk, and then I resolved not to try to walk again until I had competency in all of the primitive movement patterns that walking depended on. If I needed to go anywhere, I would crawl. If I woke up in the middle of the night and needed the toilet, once I was past the bedpan stage, I would get out of bed, I would crawl to the toilet, and I would go there. If I was watching television and I needed or wanted something from the kitchen, I would crawl out to the kitchen and use what I needed. And if I wanted to go to bed at night, I would crawl out the living room, crawl up the stairs, and then crawl to my bedroom. And the only time I wasn't actively living my rehab was when I went out of the house, and at which point I was in a wheelchair. And this living my recovery, it helped me gain new insight into the process. Whenever I would want something, say that the television controls are similar, I would crawl over to them, but then I would get up onto my knees to free up my hands so I could do something useful with them. Now that is hugely significant. When you go up into a tall kneeling position, as far as your posture is concerned, you're standing up, but without the complexity of the knees and the ankles. You're nowhere near as tall, so you have a far lower center of gravity, and you therefore experience a significantly reduced challenge. And in this way, you're practicing and gaining the skills of supporting your weight over a vertical pelvis. And crucially, you're doing so with only 2 points of contact for your base of support. And to aid stability, you've got your lower limbs acting as 2 great big feet. So you're practicing all of the new and requisite skills of standing, but you're doing so in a low challenge environment. And in the earliest phase of learning any skill, a low challenge is going to be essential. And what's equally important is that the cost of failure is low. Unlike when trying to walk, where if you fail, if you fail from the kneeling position, you don't fall from a great height. You don't face plant and break your nose. You just put your hands down and you start again. If there's a cost of failure, then there's going to be a fear of failure, and any fear of failure will hijack any attempt to learn authentic movement. And fear of failure forces the individual into cognitively driven movement. The core will brace, and the entire movement will become inauthentic. And this is exactly what we don't want when we're learning to move. So when I returned home, I recorded my recovery on an online YouTube blog, and I'd like to show you some of the videos here. I'll start with talking to the camera on my first day home, and then I'll show that baseline walking that I also recorded on my first day home. If you just bear with me for a second, I'm going to try and log on to my laptop again, which I'll be able to show you the videos. Just to return to it, this is me talking to the camera after my first day back after stroke and surgery, and then the video after it will be me trying to walk on that day, which will have been the last time I tried to walk before trying to regain my skills authentically.
My name's Steve. I had a brain hemorrhage just on 3 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago yesterday. I had a cavernoma, which is a venous, or sorry, vascular malformation It was on my brainstem. That's where I am at the minute.
Every day thereafter was a rehab day, and every day I would roll, crawl, and I would practice squatting. And once I'd achieved competence in one pattern, only then would I move on to the next one. Now, the following video is 10 weeks after my surgery, and the development in my movement quality is quite clear. My vision was still badly distorted. Quick, reactive or dynamic movement was still way beyond me, and I would have difficulty touching a finger to my nose, and I couldn't process more than one thing at a time. I think the audience here is overwhelmingly female, so you're probably just thinking, there's another bloke who can't multitask. But the level of multitasking I'm talking about is just like walking and talking at the same time. But my movement was becoming ever more expansive, and this in itself is going to further drive neuroplasticity. So, but I'll let you be the judge of that. This is 10 weeks further on. I showed that video to my surgeon, Mr. Mario Teo, during a 6-month follow-up appointment, and he said the only reason he believed it was because he knew that he did the surgery and he knew the time frame. He said if I'd showed it to another neurosurgeon and told them that it was only 10 weeks after 10.5 hours of brainstem surgery, then they'd just laugh. As a result of that, he asked if I'd make him a video of my recovery up to that point for him to take to a conference, and the following is an excerpt from that.
With 2 o'clock, 2nd of Jan, 7 months into me stroke recovery. Well, sweet dreams in the Blue Mountains. There's the landscape. Through this little crack that I'm wedged in. Oh, some other climbers struggling just round the corner. There's Ant there. Hopefully just going straight up. I'm going to follow.
That last video was up to 7 months post-op. Now, whilst this will mostly cover the period within which the classic model would expect to see improvement, I would suggest it's probably fair to say that what I'd achieved up to that point was beyond clinical expectations. But regardless of this, I still had all of the deficits I previously mentioned, and according to the classic model, I was not going to see any further improvement. I still couldn't run, I couldn't drive, and multitasking was difficult or unavailable. But my recovery curve had been consistent throughout that 7 months. And if anything, I was improving more rapidly, and I had real confidence that I could drive further neuroplasticity. Learning to run was a constant focus of mine, and it was 10 months after surgery that I was able to perform short bouts of running, and after 12 months I could run a continuous mile. Now, the limiting factor was not cardiovascular capacity. That was fine. I was able to prove my heart and lungs on the rower machine. The limiting factor was that my running technique resembled something out of the Lord of the Rings. I could only sustain short bouts of intensity or duration, otherwise I would incur injury. Now that's just like those SAS recruits on selection. I needed to improve my movement quality before I looked at improving any measures of quantity. I needed to reinforce the right patterns. My drive to improve my movement quality was relentless. And here's a video that demonstrates my progress at 2 years post-surgery. Now this is a full 18 months into the no progress zone of the classic model. But I'd like to think it shows pretty significant improvement.
How you doing? It is, I think it's the 3rd of June, 2019, basically 2 years after my stroke and surgery on my brainstem. Little demonstration of what's possible on with respect to recovery. The stroke robbed me of the ability to walk. The surgery robbed me of the ability to even crawl, so I had to build my movement skills back up from the very bottom. It was anticipated there was every chance that up to 3 years after my surgery I'd still be using a walker or a Zimmer frame. But anyway, here's the results of what I've been doing. How's that?
Now, these are all pretty significant gains, and today, which is almost 4 years post-surgery, I'm still making improvements, and often significant ones. But the accepted model is that no significant improvement is possible after 6 months, and that the patient should be focusing on coping strategies. So why do stroke outcomes in these other cases have such a limited prognosis? I don't have any magic genes. I've never been the most physically talented in any of my peer groups, and I've never been the most skillful. And whilst I'm proud of my physical accomplishments, they've all been the result of hard work and dedication. And yes, this is something which, you know, could be considered worthy of credit, but it's something that's open to all. Hard work is not the preserve of the talented. It's often quite the opposite. And hopefully I can dispel any magic gene theory by taking you through a case study of a patient in the US who have been rehabbing remotely using video technology. I'll read here from her medical notes prior to me working with her. Her name's Chelsea, and she was hospitalized on the 12th of July in 2016 and this was following a hemorrhage from a pontine brainstem carcinoma. She underwent successful brainstem surgery, and her post-surgery deficits were severe ataxia, which is a lack of control of the limbs. She was unable to walk or crawl. She had nystagmus and distorted vision, and she had problems with speech. She couldn't touch a finger to her nose or accurately form an opposable thumb and finger on either hand. But she had had gold-plated medical care, way beyond something which could be provided by the state. She'd received 4 months long-term inpatient care immediately after surgery, and then she continued with weekly physiotherapy for the next 3.5 years until November 2019, when she was told that her existing deficits could not be improved upon. She was given something called a SARA assessment, which is a scale for assessment and rating of ataxia. Now, a score of greater than 16.25 on this translates to severe dependence for activities of daily life. A score of greater than 19.6 will equate to wheelchair dependence for ambulation. Now, this is 3.5 years on, and Chelsea's score was 20. And given the classic model states no significant improvement after 6 months, Chelsea's medical notes would tend to agree with this. I, however, saw cause for optimism. And here's a video of Chelsea in April 2019, and this is almost 3 years post-surgery, and it's prior to her working with me.
Oh snap. Wait, I'm so pushy. Brandon, you pushing me?
Never.
I feel like he's pushing me.
Notice how the harness is supporting Chelsea's weight. Now, this will remove cost and fear of failure, which is a good thing. But the ambulation pattern is not built upon, and therefore not integrating with the patterns that are required to walk in the real world. Note also that she's not self-propelling; she's being pushed, and this then requires use of a cane to maintain control. This is not going to translate to authentic walking. I started working with Chelsea in earnest in March of 2020, and our rehab sessions were carried out over Zoom, still are. My strategy was no different than the one I'd applied to myself. I would progress through the neural development sequence one step at a time, and I'd ensure competence at each level before moving forward. I started working with Chelsea almost 4 years post-surgery, and in total contrast to the expectation of the classic model, the last 10 months have seen consistent and significant improvements. And here's some more videos of some of the patterning drills, namely for tall kneeling and the squat. And there's a final video showing her overall progress. You notice here how useful the tall kneeling posture is, and how from the knees up it's identical to standing. You can see Chelsea's ataxia and her inability to control her limbs. Now, in the real world, movements and certainly the primitive movement patterns are never performed in cold, isolated or sterile environments. They're always linked together, and that this is an important concept to factor into rehab. You'll notice there that Chelsea started supine, and then she used a rolling pattern, then a crawling pattern, and she's now going into a forward half kneeling pattern to facilitate transfer into the squat. She still needs a balance aid, as you can see, but you'll see a squat is a good quality pattern.
I keep on just pushing to the heels.
And all of this is going to drive neuroplasticity, and that will drive improvement as well. And you'll see that directly contrasted in this video. Do an under switch. This is a recording of an online rehab session I performed. And just adjust the feet, and as Patrick says, look down and make sure that you're happy with where everything is.
That's a good assumption.
That looks a good position. See if you want to do the hands clasped in front of you first, get your breathing sorted. Keep those knees forward. Oh, wow. Best I've seen by a country mile. Now, those knees have got to bend first on the way down. Break at the knees before you, that's it.
On the upper part. I tried to go for walking, but
Yeah, it looked a lot better.
So to summarize, I'd like to finish with the contrast of the two models and why I believe the classic model is founded on limiting beliefs. The biomechanical principles behind authentic movement patterns are consistent regardless of whether or not the subject's trying to acquire absent patterns or improve quality and performance in existing movement. New movement skills are the result of first establishing the most primitive pattern and layering subsequent primitive patterns on top, and then culminating in a complex skill. Movement rehabilitation using the classic model frequently has poor outcomes because the first aspirant skill attempted is walking. This is the equivalent of trying to construct a 10-story building and starting with the 8th floor. If significant fear and cost of failure present when trying to meet a movement objective, then the resultant cognitive intent and the neuroplastic outcome is just to survive the movement rather than learn it. A failure of the classic model is that it always addresses the situation as purely a software problem. Yes, a neurological injury is a software injury, but the barrier to recovery is both a hardware and a software problem. And you can't learn or exhibit a physical skill in a range of movement that doesn't exist, or in one that isn't available. If someone has physically lost this posture or range of movement, then simply trying to walk isn't going to restore it. That's putting the horse before the cart. The neural development sequence has already been successful with every single able-bodied planet, every single able-bodied person on the planet, and everyone listening in today. For the brain injury patient to acquire an authentic walking pattern, the therapist must first ensure that sufficient mobility exists. And then, rather than immediately attempting to relearn walking, the subject should learn the skills that walking depends on. And he or she should do so in a low challenge environment and in one that limits both fear and cost of failure. And if this approach is taken, then there doesn't have to be this glass ceiling at 6 months. And I'd like to think that the two case study examples that are presented here are fairly compelling evidence of that. However, I would welcome questions, and thanks everyone for listening, and apologies for the for the technical flaws mid-presentation. So any questions, far away, please. Daniela, you're on mute.
Yeah, so it is absolutely impressive. My question is, do you plan to do a study to assess more variables, duration since injury, age, previous fitness, and so on and so on? Because I think it will be a fascinating study, and you need to convince. It's very convincing, but with numbers, you would obviously convince and make your method accepted as a standard.
I have an amount of video evidence of other clients I've worked with, and some 6 and 7 years post injury. Some of them suffered a coma afterwards. A study would be marvelous, and as with all studies, it would cry out for budget. So I would love to. Danielle, that's a great idea, and I would like to.
I think there will be lots of funding bodies who would be impressed by this data, and I'm sure they will be happy to fund.
Well, if anybody listening in has got any advice or any knowledge or contacts on anything like that, I'd love to hear it, and I'd be all ears. Thank you, Danielle. Any other questions? Well, if anyone would like either any follow-up on that, any further information, potentially any of the videos, etc., just leave your contact details in the chat. I can also send you the presentation that was done for the World Congress for Neuro Rehabilitation, and give you some other related stuff as well. So thanks ever so much for listening in, and I say once again, if anyone if anyone does have any last minute questions, please fire. But Crispin?